Chaos engulfs Libya as thousands take to the streets against continuing power cuts, rising prices, and the failure of politicians to set an election date. Last week, protesters stormed parliament in the eastern city of Tobruk before setting it on fire. The turmoil is being made worse by the continuing blockade of Libya's oil sector by rival political factions, starving the country of fuel and export earnings. But most of the growing frustration in Libya is centered on the months of political deadlock paralyzing the country. Libya was set to hold presidential and parliamentary elections in December last year. The vote was meant to cap a UN-led peace process that ended years of heavy fighting between the country's UN-backed government in Tripoli against illegal militias centered in the east. But the election never took place due to disagreements over the election's legality and who would be eligible to run. Fears are now growing that the country could see a return to the violence last seen in 2020 when warlord Khalifa Haftar launched a brutal campaign to take Tripoli. And to discuss the protests that are engulfing Libya, I'm joined by Nouman Cherkaoui from Rabat. He is an analyst at the Policy Center for the New South, a think tank based in Morocco. And from Manchester, Ahmed Sewelhi, he is a political analyst who specializes on Libya. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Nouman, what's behind the latest protests rocking Libya?
Thank you for having me on. So I think right now what's going on is the perfect storm. So we're seeing extremely high costs for Libyans. We're seeing power cuts up to 18 hours a day, and we're seeing a political process that is failing. So Libyans now are fed up. They need change. It's been 10 years of the same thing over and over again, the recycled themes, multiple governments, fractured institutions. So now I think this is the best reflection of that Libyans understand what's going on in this process, that it's only elites working together to ensure that they remain in power at the expense of the interests of the Libyan people. So as a result, now we're seeing these protests all over the country, and they're not ideologically homogenous. You're seeing Qaddafi supporters with non-Qaddafi supporters. You're seeing different demands like, less electricity costs, changes to the political process. And what unites all of these protests is the need for change, a need for a different sort of framework. And I think it's time for the international community to start leveraging that.
So, Ahmed, what's your take on that? I mean, how significant is that protests are taking place both in the east and the west of Libya at the same time?
These are quite significant protests, probably the biggest protests I think we've seen since 2011 during the Qaddafi era and his fall. And exactly, the main reason is that people are now suffering. And they are suffering because of the incompetence of their own leaders, and they're also brawling for power. But also the international community, they are also at loggerheads about how they should deal with Libya, because every country that's involved has their own interests and they are backing different camps. Mm-hmm. Prices have gone very high now. There's oil blockade by Khalifa Haftar for the umpteenth time, which is affecting that, and also affecting, most importantly, electricity supply in this heat at the moment, which is just people are really suffering. There's no air conditioning, there's no lighting, and people are really suffering. That's why they've taken to the streets now to say that enough is enough, and they want change instead of this stalemate.
So, Nouman, could this collective reaction lead the Libyan people uniting in some way? Could they finally put aside their political and ideological differences and transform their current system, or does the mistrust run too deep?
Well, I think ultimately this is a rare opportunity for change. I think that if we're looking for a Libyan-led sort of paradigm, this is it. The Libyan people are making it clear that we need to see a consensus-based mediation process take place, and the electoral roadmap that is representative and contains bad faith actors. And in that regard, intensified diplomacy will help. So whether Libyans are able to unite, I think, is more reflective of whether elites are able to put the interests of Libya in front of theirs. And what past has shown and recent history has shown is they are not able to. And that's what's led to these protests.
But Ahmed, Libya's Tripoli-based government has admitted that it has underestimated the problem. But what's next now? I mean, what can it offer to the protesters?
I mean, the Libyan government in Tripoli, it's very hard for them to actually act by themselves, whilst at the same time, as I said, you have these international powers backing certain groups. So, for example, you have France, Egypt, and Russia backing a parallel government in eastern Libya under Khalifa Haftar and normally under Fathi Bashara. The problem is, it's the same problem again and again and again. We are looking for transitional solutions, transitional governments, when the solution is to have elections just like any other place in the world. We should not be reinventing the wheel. The way for people to unite and to agree a new government and to agree a proper system, because there is no system at the moment, is by holding elections, holding parliamentary elections where everybody can choose their representatives, and then under this new parliament, people can sit down and talk and agree. Otherwise, in this chaos of transitional government after transitional government, and based shady deal after shady deal, the same problems we will be seeing continuing again and again and again, and people will still continue to suffer, whether it's via war or because of the economy. People will continue to suffer.
So, Noman, after seeing these protests, do you think Libya's political factions will able to get an agreement for an election and new constitution soon?
Well, I think the clear irony is that the GNU came to get rid of the HOR and HCS, but now they're trying to do the opposite by designating this new government by Bashara. So, unfortunately, while we're seeing these sort of movements, they're ignoring the core issues. They're ignoring the need for elections and the need for a constitutional framework. Yes, they have been meeting up in Egypt recently, but the differences remain, fundamental differences over who should run for elections. Are war criminals allowed to run? And these sort of questions should have been answered a long time ago. And increasingly, Libyans are understanding that they need more support from the international community to leverage, for example, oil revenues. We're seeing the United States start to encourage that sort of proposal. So maybe through that and through more measures that show these elites that if they don't change and if they don't understand that this is unsustainable, then we might see conflict relapse. We might see big issues, including, for example, we're seeing the LLAF, Haftar's armed groups. They're increasing their military posture in the south. We're seeing the Misrata, the Sirte road closed in some places. So we do need to see change. This is unsustainable.
So, Ahmed, do you believe that the Western world now regrets toppling longtime leader Muammar Qaddafi? And do you think they have miscalculated the dynamics of the country?
Well, if some Western countries thought it was in their interests one way or another to topple Gaddafi or not, I think the most important thing here is that the people of Libya are able to express their views. Let's not forget that part of what's happening now is because for 42 years, there was no such thing as elections in Libya. There was no such thing as actually having a debate about anything. And the people of Libya are still very, very new to this, what they see or what they experience now as a new concept, a new experience of electing their own leaders and having parliament. There's no such thing as a parliament before. The issue is that I think in Geneva last year, when the United Nations and the West, they actually were backing an electoral process. They backed bringing Libyans together in Geneva. They only went through with it halfway. They did not complete the mission. They did not, for example, take any punitive action against those who are now stopping elections. They were now against elections. That's where the issue is. There needs to be some power behind behind the work they've already done.
So back in October 2021, the 5+5 Joint Military Committee had agreed on the withdrawal of foreign forces, Noman, and mercenaries from the country, but that did not materialize. Why? And what's the Western world's position here now? Are Western countries likely to push for a genuine agreement this time around?
Why it didn't materialize was because there was no implementation plan offered. It was completely rooted in rhetoric. All the international community has been able to do is send ceasefire observers, which is a peripheral solution to a really structural problem. And it's disingenuous to expect international powers to gratuitously give up their leverage. And this includes countries like Russia, for example, when with a small amount of Wagner mercenaries, they're actually being really fundamental in terms of leading the direction of Eastern authorities and how they should leverage the oil infrastructure of Libya. And now 85% of Libya's oil production is down because of, fickle and short-sighted decisions. So the international community in that sense has been mostly rhetorical. We're seeing like the Berlin process and things, and they have been they've always been saying the right things. But in terms of doing the right things, it's going to be politically controversial for these countries, but it is necessary, because if they keep going along the same path, they're going to lead to further destabilization, not only of Libya but of the region at large, including through migration, including through weapons outpouring to the Sahel. We've seen some of that. So time is of the essence.
So, Ahmed, how about the regional players? I mean, could the latest normalization efforts in the region by the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar help solve Libya's political stalemate, or do these powers have diverging interests in the country?
Well, I mean, things are changing all the time. For example, Egypt's influence at the moment in the east of Libya is much stronger than it used to be, whereas the UAE's intervention seems to be diminishing. As you said, Turkey is also, meeting with these countries, and they were totally against them and Russia in the 2019-2020 Tripoli war. So I think there's definitely a role to play for those regional powers to sit down and help, basically sit down and agree a structure, a system on how to get Libya going forward, because this cannot go on and on. We're having a kind of cycle every 2-3 years, the same thing. We're starting from scratch again and again. So it's definitely, there's the involvement of the regional powers, but also I think the United Nations Security Council has to take stronger action. However, that's going to be quite difficult with France and Russia backing a particular side. Yes. But I think the time is now, upon us, that we really, before instability spreads throughout the Mediterranean, which could very well happen with another war, I think the United Nations really has to get involved much more at the Security Council level.
All right, we'll have to wait and see about it. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.